So I had a question this week that I wanted to ask Google. And when I got to the why do, what began to fill in the gaps was a variety of predictions that Google had for me, probably based on algorithms and whatnot, about what it thought I wanted to actually know. It thought maybe I wanted to know why dogs eat grass, or why cats need, or apparently, it thinks I really should like pets. But this is real time. This is my computer on Tuesday at 3:45 p.m. All right, so when you look at that screenshot, that's kind of what Google's aim is to do. It's trying to make my life simpler by, answering the question for me when I get to the why do. Spoiler alert, I had wanted to know something about hurricanes, which had nothing to do with the questions going on here. Right? And so I think there's certain topics, when you hear, the reading of God's word, that you go, I wonder, I've never heard a sermon about that, right? Like, if today's topic was, is there life on other planets? The predictive text in your mind would not start filling in from points of pain or unhelpful conversations that have been had in the past, unless, of course, you are from another planet. Maybe you're here and you're a resident Martian, you go, I've got something to say about this. But with this topic, one of the challenges of walking in the light together as a community of believers is I say this, you hear that. Right? That happens, doesn't it? Like you ever have that happen in your interpersonal conversation? You say one thing, but because of the moment, the pain, the hurt, someone hears it entirely differently. And so with that, the words Renee shared from the Sermon on the Mount are Jesus' words. They are to be elevated, taken seriously, heard. But one of the challenges our brains are kind of firing with already is that some of us hear it and we're like, it's kind of like the Google machine, where we're like, okay, it's a good day to look at FanDuel parlays. It's a good day to think about my grocery list. Or it's a good day to sort of mentally check out, because this is a deeply painful conversation for me. So one of the things I would just offer to you, and I think this is true every week with every conversation, whether we're talking about space aliens or Matthew 5:27-32, is that there's probably some areas of your story where you feel quite comfortable that Jesus is trying to prod or encourage or nudge to a place of hey, have you thought about this? What if we excavated this a little bit more? And then there's other areas where, as a sense of protection, you're going to lean into that fight instinct or that flight instinct, where I hope and pray that you might feel, whether today or at some point in the future, just the embrace of the Father in this particular area of your story. Because I think there's probably some areas where it is quite sore for you. It hurts deeply. And the love of God is not moving towards you in order to scold and to shame, but to invite and embrace. The challenge, of course, for all of us is finding the distinction when that predictive text is going off in our minds, right? So what do we make of Jesus' words, and what do we make of Jesus' invitation? What do we do with this passage? I think the first thing we have to do with this passage is it true in a standalone thing? Yes. I would argue that these words of Jesus can be isolated from their context, and I think they hold up as an important conversation to be had. But I think we would do best to look at the whole of what Jesus is going for. So I don't aim to be paternalistic or aim to be condescending when I'm now let's remember the context of the Sermon on the Mount. Because you might be walking in this room for the first time and not heard the past 2 weeks. So I'm going to be super fast when I do this. More to say, but I think it does matter. I do think it matters for the sake of our time. Remember, the passage begins with a group of people on a mountainside who are not necessarily buying into Roman occupation and not necessarily buying into the religious leaders of their time that are gathering and trying to make sense of who Jesus is and what Jesus is about. He says the blessed life, the good life, the Beatitudes are available. The blessed life is available to people who are poor in spirit, people who are mourning, people that are persecuted because they try to do the right thing. What is all of that a shadow of? Hey, the good life is available to people not that level up and like show how spiritually amazing they are, but in the lowly condition the people find themselves in the moment that they're hearing it. The kingdom of God has moved toward you who are poor in spirit, who are mourning, who are dealing with really heavy, hard things. The blessed life, the good life is available to you even now in that. In fact, you're still going to be salt. You're still going to be light. Like, you embrace this. God is using your story to do a really terrific and beautiful work in the world. Then we jump to what we did last week, which is say, in this comes a conversation that's very prudent for the first century. How do you make sense of a 1,000-year-old Mosaic law and like its implications for a time where the geography may not look that different, but the geopolitical landscape is way different? So there's rabbis and there's teachers that are like, hey, you take all that Levitical stuff and you light it on fire. We're doing a new thing. And you get others that are like, no, you double down. You take the laws and then the laws and the rules we made about how we follow the laws, and you worship that stuff, and that's how we'll make this area great again. And Jesus goes, okay, I have not come to abolish this. In other words, if you think that we're going to burn the book of Leviticus, nope, that's not what we're doing here. I've come to fulfill it. In fact, chapter 5, verse 20, unless your righteousness surpasses, unless the way in which you live into what I say surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, who are the socially acceptablest of the socially acceptable, unless your righteousness surpasses theirs, you can't even enter this kingdom based on my criteria. Now, what is that supposed to do? That is supposed to take someone who feels outsided by this for just a minute, and all the comfort they felt from the initial blessing, go, wait, what? And for just a moment, to take those dudes that are like, we got to double down on these rules, and we'll put the fun in fundamentalism if we do that, like, and for a second it feels like red meat. Oh, yeah, be like us. And then, and this is where we are, Jesus gives 6 different case studies for like what he actually means, which flips the script on who is uncomfortable by the end of this. That the person who puffs their chest and thinks they're in the right standing is like, wait, what? And the person who's been othered by people like that are like, oh, maybe there's something bigger going on here. Last week, Jesus said, hey, we can measure righteousness by just saying, hey, who's never killed a guy? And some of us would raise our hands, and some of us wouldn't. And I'm wondering if you're introverts or if you have a secret to hide, right? But what Jesus says, hey, the better invitation to measure our righteousness than that is to say, in what ways have you been the victim of anger that's been corrupted to contempt? And how is that brought disaster to people you love? And how has that impacted you, and other people have let that anger that's become contempt impact you? And the similar motion of things is happening today, right? Jesus says, hey, in the 10 Commandments, you can find a rule about adultery, and you can find a rule about divorce. So if we stop at 3 of 6, the Pharisee, who's being modeled by chapter 5, verse 20 as a bastion of like righteousness, is like, hey, the good news is available to the person that's never killed somebody, has never been divorced, and has never cheated on their spouse. Oh, okay, like we might laud that as any of those things is commendable, right? And is that a good thing to aspire to? I would say so. I would say those are all good things that most of us would go, yeah, like I don't think any of us like set out upon our day looking necessarily to bring devastation to the people around us. But what does it leave behind? Who does that standard of righteousness leave behind? Here's my short list. How about people of low social capital who are exploited in the Roman Empire by the sexual behaviors of others? And it's legal. How about the people who feel the sting of another person's marital unfaithfulness? How about the people who have been used and objectified by the lusts of another and then, in a real cherry on top, get blamed for it? How about the people that look externally acceptable, just like Jesus describes, but are dying inside with an addiction to lust that's eating them alive and enslaving them? Or the people of a second and third generation that just go, yeah, like, bystander here, this hurts deeply and provides earthquakes to family around us, right? Is the standard of Jesus' flourishing just propping up the good? Now, here's a guy who's never killed a man with his bare hands and has never cheated. He's a husband of one wife. Give him a hand. Like, or is there a more beautiful invitation of flourishing? That's the question of the Sermon on the Mount. Here's how Jesus widens the circle. He widens the circle to say, what about creating a community in these second and third case studies that elevates rather than commoditizes other people? That pursues their flourishing, not just what can I get out of people to gratify what makes me feel like I've made it, like I'm okay. And this is the conversation that the second and third case studies really point to, this stewardship of sexual longings and intimate relationships. Like the stewardship of those things, by stewarding those particular things, we can create places that help us bring flourishing to people we care about and can create flourishing for us. And that the stewardship of this conversation is not just for the married dudes or the women who are making them stumble, but for everybody to be part of what this community of flourishing looks like. And that's why it's a better invitation than just the one of the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious leaders. So let's break that down. How do we elevate others in the pursuit of sexual integrity? That's the conversation Jesus is trying to have with points 2 and points 3. I'll say the 3 things and then we'll dive into them for a few minutes. He says first, because between distinguishing between sexual desire and lust, right? Said succinctly, the issue is not that we're attracted to people, like that's quite human, but what we do with our attractions and how we steward our attractions. The second part, by stressing the importance of creating stewardship of attraction so that we can delineate between lust and sexual desire, and then by honoring covenantal relationships so that we don't engage in them flippantly. Right? So that we don't fall into the trap of the elevated view that says, I need someone to be someone or I'm not someone, nor the other side of that, which is just like, these are contracts. Contracts get broken. Move on. Come on. Why are we being prudes? Let's break these things down. So the first one, Jesus says, you've heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's from the 10 Commandments. But I tell you that anyone that looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery with her in his heart. The operative word in this conversation is lustfully. The operative word in this conversation is lustfully. It's not whoever looks at a woman and ever got some kind of attraction. The operative word here is lustfully. Right? Is attraction the issue? Is Jesus trying to just tell you to repress everything? Or is he talking about a situation that is fueled and fed or acted upon by how we steward that desire? Right? So the Aramaic and the Greek point to this word of like this idea of lingering. Right? Like when you have some sort of like thought, but then like you hover on it and obsess over it. And like make a pathway to get it in some particular way. Like Willard says it this way in Divine Conspiracy, when a desire is not just desired, but embraced, indulged, elaborated, fantasized for the purposeful entertainment and stimulation of desire. But draw separation there between, well, what's the deal? I'm like attracted to people. I think people are beautiful. Like to like this other side of it, right? And the issue here, of course, is not if you read the Bible in totality, The Bible doesn't seem to be against sexual desire. You can read Song of Solomon. It's quite vivid in imagery, you know. You can read Genesis 2. You can see this idea of like Adam and Eve being naked and unashamed as like poetic language for this deep longing and oneness. The Bible doesn't seem to be anti like desire. It seems to be anti the corruption of that desire with how we act upon or fuel particular areas of our heart, right? I don't probably have to tell you that this hurts people. I probably don't have to make a case for you that the lusts of another person could bring you harm. You know, particularly those of you that like have been objectified in some, whether it's I don't have to spend a lot of time probably trying to convince you that this is not part of the flourishing of God's picture, right? I think the challenge is sort of owning it without just piling on the shame on top of it. Right? To say, yes, it's not just this thing that exists when this guy engages in this thing, or this person says that, but in my own heart, there is the ability to commoditize relationships rather than elevate other people. Like to gratify my own desires on the backs of using people, and that is a corrupting influence. Any healthy talk we have about sexual desire and the spectrum of sexual desire, this is Jesus' point. This is Dr. Lucy Peppert. She says it this way. The whole problem with lust is that it's like a virus that like gets into any healthy version of this conversation that we could have, right? And if you go back to the days of like your AOL instant messenger, like downloading a virus from the chat, like, you know, I remember that being a thing in our family. Like it was a real ordeal. And like that's it. Any healthy and the light conversation about sexual desire, sexual attraction, gets corrupted by this conversation about lust, and that's the problem. So what does Jesus call this audience to do? To shepherd and steward this conversation, right? Because if lust is about consumption, love is about communion. If lust is about taking, love is about giving. If lust uses or lets ourselves be used, love honors. If love diminishes other people, love cherishes the other. And lust just kind of gets in the way of our ability to give or receive this particular thing. So this is not just a conversation about sexual sobriety. This is a conversation about human connection. Right? Naked and unashamed, Genesis chapter 2, right? Before sin enters this conversation. So if lust has this destructive power, how do we steward it? That's this corollary that follows next. So let's take a look at this. This is a fun verse. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body then the whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Let's talk about three things really, really fast that are going to help us have this conversation, hopefully with integrity. First, I said it last week, Jesus references Gehenna here again, hell. In your notes, if you scan that QR code that follows along, you can go to the sermon notes. There's like a 5-minute video that gives explanation about how Jesus is giving a little different picture of hell than like devils and pitchforks, like running around with whatever medieval imagery that you've witnessed at some point and went, oh, that's a really weird looking thing. It's different. It's just different than that. That's all I'll say. It's not like, it's just different. So if you're interested in that and that's a tripping point for you, check out that video. I think it'll be helpful. Second, Jesus is using hyperbolic language here. I think I told you a couple weeks ago that as a 15-year-old boy, I panicked after like lunch and church when I read this verse for the first time, and I was like, what does one do to gouge out one's eye? And oh, by the way, I don't remember anyone at church like not having their eyes, not having their arms. And so what is happening in all of this, right? This is hyperbole. This is a literary device. So when we get into like the weeds of inspiration and inerrancy sometimes, like part of what we have to do when we read the Bible is understand that Jesus is using hyperbolic language here, right? He's not telling you, gouge out your eye, chop off your hand. okay? Don't have to do that. Origen tried that, like he castrated himself. Jerome would throw himself, it said, into rose bushes every time he felt sexual desire. That's a whole other sub-conversation called asceticism, which I think we could, I think Paul has a lot of conversation about. That's not what Jesus is talking about here, all right? So we don't have to show up next week with eye patches, right? And unarmed, right, in that sense. So, okay, what are we actually talking about? One more thing I think we need to point to is, so in Jesus' hyperbolic language, the one thing he does make pretty clear, if your hand, if your eye, what do Christians love to do in this conversation? If their eye, if their hand. How would we have a helpful conversation about lust and its devastating effects on the church? If they would just, then I could just. Fill in that blank a number of ways, right? Like from the, well, if they would just control the way they behaved, then we could just have an integrity-based conversation on this topic. We love to tell other people how to set healthy boundaries. We struggle with our own. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have conversations collectively about healthy boundaries. That's what healthy and healing communities do. The challenge is we often only want to have that dimension of the conversation, which clouds any communicator's ability to bring a verse like this to bear without that predictive text. So where are we going with this, right? Jesus says, if your eye, if your hand, so on some level, right, there is a look in the mirror about, okay, whether I'm a 12-year-old boy in the audience or an 80-year-old man or a 35-year-old woman, like I'm invited to take seriously that my lack of boundaries or safeguards could be corrupting my ability to receive the fullness of Jesus' invitation here. Why does any of that matter? I would argue because Jesus does take your longings and desires seriously. So seriously that corrupting them with lust is clouding our ability to have them with integrity. Right? The old adage or idiom about like pornography and porn culture was like, it's not that it shows us too much, it's that it shows us too little. Like it's reductionist and clouds our ability to connect with people in different ways, right? So this idea of boundaries, right, it's a healthy way for us to think about this. He's encouraging the boundaries. They can be for our benefit. You already do this with cars, firearms, flames, putting things over the outlets so that your children don't poke their fingers in them, or so that your dogs don't have wet paws, or, in terms of like the boots. You set boundaries on all variety of things. So of course you're going to have, of course this comes into your life in some way. Now, let's be clear. What does Christian culture love to do? What do Pharisees love to do? They love to worship the boundary and not worship the spirit of the thing that's being invited to be experienced, right? So that's an important distinction for us to say, hey, Jesus does take this seriously, but not so that we can just be shamed, but so that we can have like naked and unashamed conversations about the deepest longings of the human spirit. Right? And what it means to be covenantal people that don't elevate relationships as like the penultimate, like this is the thing I get out of people to feel gratified, but a way that I contribute myself to a bigger conversation about human flourishing. Lastly, the third case study. So that's case study number 2. We've talked about anger, we've talked about lust. Now we're going to hit divorce, this lighthearted topic. That's very easy to break down in 3 to 5 minutes. Okay, Jesus actually is pretty quick with it. He says, it's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. That's coming from Deuteronomy chapter 4. It's a deep cut. One of two verses in 613 from the book of from the Old Testament about divorce, right? And then he continues on. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. I'm not trying to rush through the gravity of those sentences, but I do think the context here matters. Deuteronomy 24 is probably a deep cut for you. It's not in the first century because when there's only two verses, when only two parts of the law attributed, there's a whole lot of time spent arguing by a lot of people about what these two things mean. So over 1,000 years, there becomes two schools of thought on this topic. One is the school of Shammai. The school of Shammai says that if a woman is sexually immoral, you can give her you can divorce her, and then here's the process by which you do that. And the certificate of divorce, by the way, is like the distinction between almost like an annulment, so it keeps everybody in good standing, or versus hey, we need to scandalize this person. And oh, by the way, only men can do this. Women are not allowed to file for divorce in Mosaic law. Okay, fine. This is weird, right? School of Shammai says, all right, well, it's only for adultery. And oh, by the way, adultery is really hard to prove. If you've ever wondered why in John chapter 8, a group of men are really excited to grab a woman caught in adultery into the streets and make a parade of her, it's because adultery in Mosaic law is really, really difficult to prove, and they caught a woman in the act. Bravo, red meat. We get to have a real conversation here. That's part of why it's such a big deal in John 8. The school of Hillel says, if you look at the Hebrew, that you can look at Deuteronomy 24. It's he would conclude, and you can find this in some of the writings about the school of Hillel on this topic. If a woman burns the food, and you have a problem with that, and you don't feel like having a conversation about the fire and whatever, move on. If someone is more aesthetically pleasing to you, you don't like the color green, but your wife really likes to wear the color green, well then, move on. The school of Hillel was hey, we just give a lot of permission to this stuff. And the certificate of divorce is a way to say, well, we did good by this person. Okay. Jesus just basically kind of sides with the school of Shammai on this topic, seems to affirm it in the Sermon on the Mount. I think it's helpful for us to jump one more place before we bring it full circle and wrap it to a close. This conversation comes up again in Matthew 19. Because in this time, it's just a group of dudes. This group of dudes comes to Jesus and goes, okay, if you're so school of Shammai, and you're so into this, then why did Moses even offer a certificate of divorce as an option to begin with? Why would that even be a thing? Fair question. If you know the text in Matthew 19, verse 8, he says, because your hearts are hard, right? He's talking to a group of dudes who are looking for loopholes and ways out, and is because we have conversations like this. This is what human beings do. To a group of survivors, he probably addresses that conversation very differently. To a group of people who have been exploited by that kind of behavior in others, the same spirit, because hearts are hard, is very true. Here's where we have to go with this. Jesus is not being prescriptive to every jot and tittle of human condition that can exist interpersonally and say, well, let me say the most succinct one. If you use the Sermon on the Mount to justify why a person who's being abused should not leave their partner, you're misquoting the Sermon on the Mount. On a whole variety of other things, what do we acknowledge? It's messy. It's messy. Jesus is not trying, and what I'm not trying to do, and what I don't think Jesus is trying to do, is be reductionist and say, well, it's just this all the time. It's to say, but part of the conversation that's being had in the zeitgeist is that people are taking conversations about the covenantal and making it transactional and contractual. That we're commoditizing. The problem is that we're being flippant about a thing that we should not be flippant about. And whether you're School of Hillel or you're School of Shammai or you're living in 2024, that's a thing we do, doesn't it? Whether it is from the perspective of elevating covenantal relationships as like, well, this is the only way I will be whole and human. I think that would fall into some of the ways Jesus would go, not so fast. Like that's not part of that. But neither is this other side where it's just like, well, there's nothing transcendent here. It's all contractual. Just do you. 20 plus years of pastoral ministry. I'm not trying to elevate myself as some expert on this topic. There's a messy middle ground in these conversations. How does the love of God move toward them? Versus just antagonizing and looking for ways to bring harm to people, right? I don't have time to go into it deeply, but most of those New Testament passages that are sort of weaponized in conversations about sex and lust are being received from people that are hearing household codes like internalized in a world where men were basically, if they're Roman citizens and they're people of esteem, they're like, yeah, do you, buddy. And the man who receives Jesus as the Lord is being told, that's not how we do things. Because do you have the legal role as a Roman citizen to do whatever you want? You do, actually. Very little recourse against you. But we're doing something different here. And to the person, this is in 1 Corinthians 7, who's only heard your body belongs to your husbands and he can do whatever he wants, the scandalous verse of 1 Corinthians 7:5 is like, his body belongs to you too. You who have no agency in a whole lot of other ways. First century woman hearing that in a Corinthian church is like, wait, what? What? That's not how the Romans do it, and that's not how Mosaic law talked about it. There's something transcendent happening here. So let's pause and just remind ourselves again where these two particular case studies, along with anger and contempt, are pointing. That the way of Jesus is inviting us to create a pathway towards flourishing for ourselves and other people in a world that uses and reduces people to just gratify themselves. And the love of God wants to probably afflict an area where you have gotten quite comfortable living in a place like that, and comfort you in a place where you have been deeply, deeply afflicted by it. How? This is where the Lord's Supper comes in. That Jesus isn't just a guy who ran around and told people what to do with their bodies. Jesus leveraged his privilege, his body, to pour out for the benefit of others, to bring forth a kingdom that is better than the invitation of the Romans or the religious leaders. Are you Jesus? No, you're not. That's good news. But you get to play a role. You get to play a role in what God is doing in the world. And that place where you feel enslaved is a place where God is inviting you to freedom. That place where you've exercised your freedom, like God is saying, hey, I think there's a better picture of freedom than the one you're expressing. And this gives us a picture and a context. So there's 4 stations in this room I would invite you to at this time. I invite you to receive. I want to move us to the center of what Christianity is. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis to conclude and be a pathway to communion. This is from C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity. Finally, though I've had some time to speak at length about sex, I want to make it as clear as possible that the center of Christian morality is not here. If one thinks that Christians regard unchastity as a supreme vice, he's quite wrong. He goes on, he ends the paragraph this way. This is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it's better to be neither. Would you pray with me as we enter this time? God, I don't share that quote to be glib. How we may feel, what we've been called, what we have experienced. This is a place where our hearts can feel deeply wounded. Lord, I don't pretend to pray over our friends today and over myself that just a quick taking of bread and cracker will resolve it. But what I do ask is that this picture of love that you've demonstrated would shape and frame how we respond in this area of our story. The parts where we feel quite prideful, and the places where we feel deep pain. Thank you for this reminder that you move toward those places and walk with us toward healing and hope. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.